It's a wonderful aircraft, absolutely wonderful. It fitted you like a glove, you see, that's what I liked about it.
Without victory in the Battle of Britain, I think it's almost certain that we would have been invaded by Germany. It was a darn close run thing.
It is the most famous plane from World War II. It played a crucial role in the Battle of Britain. But what we didn't know until now was the role that a 13-year-old girl played in its design.
Hazel's role, like so many others, has hitherto been untold. I think we can look back and be extremely grateful for the contribution she made.
We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall never surrender.
Way up in the sky, there are Messerschmitts, Junkers, Heinkels, or Dorniers that are going to get the thrashing of their lives.
In July 1940, the fate of the world hung in the balance. Britain was facing the threat of invasion from Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler knew that to win the war, he would need to invade Britain. That summer, he made the decision to attack from the air, using the mighty German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. The RAF was outnumbered 3-1. What followed in the skies above Britain that summer has been described as this country's single most important military campaign ever fought. Victory in the Battle of Britain was by no means certain and depended on the skills and bravery of young RAF pilots from Britain and her allies. They were flying the latest generation of fighter planes, the legendary Spitfires and Hurricanes. A key feature of these fighters was the way they were armed. The new planes were initially designed to carry 4 machine guns, but in the run-up to war, all that would change. Earlier this year, I was lucky enough to find out what it was like to fly in one of these iconic planes.
There we go. There's no floor. It's snug, isn't it? Amazing, wow.
Absolutely sensational. Being up here, the speed, the agility, the way the plane just, the pilot says, you're almost flying it with your fingertips. I just cannot imagine being up here in a dogfight. Oh, my stomach! Woo! Wow! I can feel the G-force. Look at that. It is such an elegant and agile fighter. Speed and surprise were the key to its success. And of course, its firepower. Wow, if we come to land.
Pilots reckoned that they could keep their sights on for about 2 seconds. So you had to find a way of bringing down an enemy bomber in just 2 seconds.
The tap of hammers in the Spitfire factories.
In 1934, as war with Germany looked increasingly likely, the British government took what many thought to be an extraordinary decision. The new generation of fighters, they said, should be armed with not 4, but 8 Browning machine guns.
Keep it up, Mrs. Smith, or is it Miss? For the Battle of Britain is your battle, too.
They'd finally been persuaded by this man, a scientific officer in the Air Ministry called Captain Fred Hill. He was convinced that with just 4 guns, the planes being developed wouldn't have enough firepower to bring down fast-moving enemy aircraft. He wanted to cram 8 powerful machine guns onto the new fighter planes, an idea that seemed excessive to many. To bolster his case, Fred turned to an unlikely person for help. A schoolgirl from North London, his 13-year-old daughter, Hazel. Hazel was an only child, a talented mathematician and a meticulous worker. She had a close relationship with her father and was in many ways the ideal assistant for Fred. Although just a teenager, it was Hazel who helped complete the intricate calculations he had to make. Most people assumed 8 guns would be too heavy for the Spitfire, that the extra load would make the nimble new aircraft slower and less manoeuvrable. Fred knew that a 4-gun design for the new fighters had already been agreed. If the plans were not changed quickly, it would be too late.
So it's 1934, you've got the Hurricane and the Spitfire under development, but it said that they only need 4 guns. You know they can catch the bombers, but now you've got to be able to kill them. And you've got 3 potential weapons available. One of them fires shells like this. This was a French Hispano 20mm cannon, and it's obviously very tempting to go for these. This one hits an airframe, it's going to come down, but there are problems with it. In order to be able to fire them accurately, they've got to have a very stiff mounting. And as you can imagine, the weapon itself is very large. So it's going to be difficult to find room in a Spitfire wing, this very flexible wing. And even the Hurricane, it turned out in practice, still didn't have a mounting stiff enough in order to be able to take any of these at the time. Your next choice will probably be this. This is actually a machine gun bullet, though it behaved more like a fast-firing cannon, and it's a 0.5-inch machine gun. Those guns were still under development, and they were very heavy. So that given the number that you would need to produce the density of fire that you require for that fire to be lethal against a contemporary bomber, you need a lot of them. And so, for the time being at least, this option was laid on one side. What you're left with is this here. It looks a real tiddler, doesn't it? It's actually a .303 rifle caliber machine gun bullet. It's the same thing that soldiers fired out of their rifles. However, it was discovered that if you group together 8 of these machine guns, Brownings firing 1,000 rounds a minute, you would produce a density of fire of 256 rounds in the 2 seconds that it was assumed a pilot would have in order to bring down a bomber. 2 seconds was all he had, given the speed at which aircraft were moving now and the difficulty of keeping your sights on. And these, 8 of them, grouped together in the wings of Hurricanes and Spitfires, are what actually won the Battle of Britain.
Doesn't help that I've got this scab on.
Without Fred Hill's persistence, it could have been a very different outcome. He was so determined to prove the need for 8 guns, not 4, that he went home armed with the results of the most recent firing trials, as well as one of the latest calculating machines. And he asked his daughter for help. Together, sitting around their small kitchen table in North London, they worked long into the night, analysing the data.
You wouldn't expect most 13-year-olds to be able to do that kind of maths, so she must be a pretty remarkable mathematician. A lot of this work was done clandestinely in secret by a few dedicated individuals who didn't really have any money available. But in a way, it's not surprising. The budgets available to these people were very sparse, if indeed they had any budget at all. And in the accounts given by a lot of them, they talk about burning the midnight oil and coming into the office late after everybody's gone to carry out further calculations and borrow some bits of equipment to carry out experiments more or less off their own bat without working very long hours, because they were really dedicated to these things. And of course people taking their work home.
This is RAF Duxford in Cambridgeshire, home to many of the Spitfires and Hurricanes during the war.
So this is a Spitfire piece of history almost.
Absolutely, yes. It's where all the work in the family...
And today Hazel's sons have brought their mother's kitchen table here for us to see.
So you have brought your kitchen table all the way from Cornwall to here, the control tower at Duxford. Explain why.
I think it's important for you to see it. This is the kitchen table, which my mother did the calculations for the guns on the aeroplanes that fought in the Battle of Britain. And I think if you're a 13-year-old girl at your kitchen table, you can change the world.
So they've got the fabric over the gun ports really nice and neatly, and before they went into action they used to just fire a couple of rounds to clear the fabric.
Hazel told her sons about her role when they were growing up.
So some mum's calculations.
And they've long been fascinated by these planes.
It was only after this work was presented and taken to the Air Ministry that they changed it to 8. And I think that's why they had to work, my mother had to work so hard into the night, because there was only a small window of opportunity. I mean, the thing could have gone into production if she'd spent months doing this, so it had to be done in weeks.
What was it like for you as you unravelled the story?
I think this can't be true. This is crazy. I mean, it seems crazy that a 13-year-old should be assisting the RAF in working out how it should arm its fighters for the next war. You just think, this can't be right.
The calculations Hazel did on a machine like this were extremely complicated.
And then a 1, and I have to keep subtracting until the bell rings, and I move along.
They showed that the future fighters needed to carry 8 machine guns, each capable of firing at least 1,000 rounds a minute, in order to have the firepower to destroy enemy planes. Captain Fred Hill presented this graph showing the analysis at a crucial meeting of the Air Ministry in July 1934. But what only he and his superior officer knew was that the calculations that led to this conclusion had been done by his daughter Hazel.
And 8 guns at the time seemed an awful lot. They called it radical, didn't they?
They called it staggering, and I think some of the higher echelons of the RAF said that's going a bit too far, because you know most of them had grown up with First World War fighters that had 1 or 2 guns on them. The idea of 4 they thought was radical. 8 was incredible.
And in the end, it was only just enough. It was only just enough. They had the edge.
Yeah. 6 years later in the Battle of Britain, 8 guns was just enough to win it. And so if we'd gone with less, if those calculations had not proven the point, it would have had a big impact.
The only public recognition Hazel ever had of her role in transforming the Spitfires and Hurricanes was in a memoir written by her father's superior officer at the Air Ministry. Until now, that is.
And it's just wonderful that Hazel's story is at last reaching the light of day, and what a great inspiration for young people today, young girls in particular, that can look upon someone like Hazel in the early 1930s making such an important contribution to our later success in the Battle of Britain, which is vital to this country's survival.
The calculations carried out by Hazel and her father resulted in both Spitfires and Hurricanes being armed with 8 rather than 4 guns. Over the next 6 years, as Britain headed towards war with Nazi Germany, the planes were tested and put into production. Each gun carried just 300 rounds. It took about 15 seconds for them all to be fired. It meant that every bullet had to count. The Spitfire was a nimble aircraft, perfect for dogfights, and their pilots loved them. So you got 3 German fighters that day?
No, one's a brigade.
Oh, right. 98-year-old squadron leader Alan Scott flew both the Spitfire and Hurricanes.
Went straight in and I was catapulted out.
Dawn, 109 bombers came in. We chased them
to get a good squirt in, saw black pieces fly upward. He also dropped his wheels. We shook them all right, and we had a fine chase. Personally, I did not get a squirt, but it was terrific fun. Happy but weary. Amazing to read that. The words "fun" come out of it all the time. There, you just, it was, I suppose, the adrenaline.
Well, we wrote down as we came down into like a diary, you see.
They thought originally it was only going to have 4 guns, and it was this young girl and her father, Captain Hill, who said, no, they need to have 8, and they did all the mathematics and worked out that if it only had 4, it wouldn't be as successful. You wouldn't be able to fire in the 2 seconds enough bullets.
No, the 4 would have been really difficult because it wouldn't give you the firepower that we had. Oh no, only glad she was able to work that out for us. We didn't know anything about this, of course. We just fly the aircraft with guns.
What do you think about it, though? I mean, that a teenage girl helped.
I know. I hadn't heard about it until you told me, of course. And marvellous. I think it's absolutely marvellous. I never thought that it would need that, you see. It's just putting guns on. You just put guns on and fire on them. You never think that mathematically they had to be coned and worked out the firepower and so on. Marvellous, absolutely marvellous.
It is amazing, isn't it, to think of a young girl with her father around the kitchen table.
It really is amazing. To hear that story was quite unique, and I liked it very much.
Tell me about your fighting. Did you actually take part in the Battle of Britain, or was it somewhat later?
Yes, the Battle of Britain went on. Of course, people forget this, of course. The official date of ending the Battle of Britain was in October 1940, but the Battle of Britain went on into 1941, of course. They didn't stop the bombers coming across just because October you finish, you know. They don't take you notice of that. They finish. So we were still scrambling to engage them way into 41 up to almost December 41. Of course, that's when I had the most effective part of it. I shot a Yonkers 88 down, my part of the Battle of Britain. But I was posted to the Siege of Malta in 42, and that's where I got most of my victories to become an ace.
The 8 guns proved to be crucial for success. What father and daughter had calculated was the exact distance the fighters had to be from the enemy to successfully hit their target.
Well, I think the biggest thing was the huge increase in speed of the new fighters, which was way beyond anything that people had experienced before. It's always very dangerous with mathematics to extrapolate it beyond its usual domain of applicability, where you check the data and make sense. So what they had to do was to take trials conducted at much lower speed and then work out what would be necessary for a really high-speed fighter. That will have been particularly difficult, very easy to get it wrong.
With 8 guns firing, the fighters typically had just 2 seconds to hit their target before pulling away. They had to get incredibly close to the enemy planes to stand a chance of shooting them down around 250 yards or almost 230 metres away. Hazel's calculations proved to be critical.
Well, the Spitfire and Hurricane were both armed with 8 Browning 303 machine guns. Their rate of fire was incredible, but the weight of fire was only just enough to take down the German bombers. There are stories of German bombers reaching France with more than 200 bullet holes in them because the calibre of the bullets we were firing was not only just sufficient. So, in fact, many German bombers escaped, perhaps damaged beyond repair, but nevertheless insufficiently damaged to shoot them down.
If Hazel and her father, as they pored over the design and the mathematics in their kitchen, if they got that wrong, if they'd underestimated the need for 8 guns, it could have been a different outcome.
A compromise could have been 6 guns. As we know, the Spitfire was originally conceived as having 4. 8 was radical. A compromise could have been 6. It certainly wouldn't have been enough. And in air combat, the margins are very, very fine. I think it's quite reasonable to think that the outcome could have been quite different.
In the end, I think one would have to say, I think the 8 guns were a pretty good decision, taken as it was back in the middle of the 1930s.
It wasn't just the Battle of Britain guns that this teenager helped develop. Hazel and her father once again used their mathematical brains to help to design an improved reflector gun sight, the way pilots lined up their guns from the cockpit, that was used throughout the Second World War. The Spitfire's maiden flight was in 1936. Hazel saw the plane on display at this air show in Hendon in June of that year. Her only reward for her hard work with her father was permission to sit briefly in the cockpit of this plane that she'd helped design. She went on to have a career in medicine, volunteering to join the Royal Army Medical Corps. She treated injured soldiers who returned from Dunkirk.
Fire and flame, death and destruction.
Civilians injured in the London Blitz. And returning prisoners of war. And as you say, she served during the war. I mean, she must have seen these Spitfires going overhead.
Oh, indeed, she did. And she tells a story of a Spitfire saving her life when she was a medical student in Aberdeen, which was a fascinating story about how she was scared by a German aircraft, turned round and saw a Spitfire chasing it away. And that was in the earliest stages of the war.
The Battle of Britain proved to be a turning point in the war. Around 1,000 RAF planes were shot down during the 4-month conflict. Germany suffered nearly twice as many losses, but the margin of victory was narrow. The 8 guns on the Spitfires and Hurricanes were only just enough to win the battle.
It's amazing, history hangs on so fine a thread, isn't it? You know, if she got the calculations wrong, or if she hadn't been asked to help, and the decision had not been made to go with 8 guns, who knows what would have happened.
It was difficult, wasn't it, for them at the time, for the people who were developing the aircraft, the guns, to actually work out what they needed to do and how they could do it, because it had never been done before, had it, on that scale?
No, indeed, and the advances were extraordinary in a very, very rapid period of time. So arriving at the figure of 8 guns and making the case persuasively to, shall we say, some conservative members of the RAF's technical board was a difficult thing to do. 8 guns was radical. In fact, later after war broke out, the idea of an 8-gun fighter was used as a propaganda tool to encourage or bolster British morale by saying, you know, our aircraft, our fighters, are 8-gun fighters. It was double what had previously been in use by the RAF, but actually was the bare minimum that we needed to achieve success in the Battle of Britain.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
The Battle of Britain pilots flew mission after mission to defeat the German Luftwaffe. Their bravery and success made victory possible, but without the support of many others, the battle would not have been won. Now, for the first time, we can add a 13-year-old schoolgirl from North London to that list.
I think history should remember her as being one of the people who made a real difference, one of the ordinary people, you know, working with their families, making a difference with their families that have an enormous impact on the overall future of and success of society. And you know, society is made up about ordinary people making a difference. And she was just one of those people who made a difference. And we're very proud of her, but lots of people made a difference in the Second World War. You know, we only won that war because so many people contributed to the national success.
She would have wanted to be remembered for her medical work, but I think history will remember her for this work. She just happened to be the right person at the right place in the right time.
Sitting around this kitchen table?
Sitting around this kitchen table, yes.
And she was a 13-year-old girl. She wasn't just an ordinary person. I mean, yes.
Extraordinary.
That is extraordinary.
Absolutely.